Most people assume photography looks like this. However, there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. And this is one of the many things we'll explore in this episode of LuminQuest. To answer this question, I believe it is best to put ourselves in the shoes of the photographer, and we'll be doing that by starting from the very beginning of that journey. Okay, so imagine with me that you are an aspiring photographer. You picked up this by finding an old camera from some relative of yours, and you start fiddling around with it, and you're like, this might be something interesting. So you do your research. You maybe grab some books, or maybe you start looking at YouTube videos, and you quickly realize that this hobby does not entail simply a press of a button. Rather, there's millions of different settings and different things you need to understand with it. At this point, you're just very much confused and curious at the same time. And the one thing that you see a lot of these people tell you is a concept called the exposure triangle. Okay, you pour over your book and you learn that exposure is controlled by 3 different variables, and these being shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And you learn how shutter speed is essentially controlling how fast the exposure time is, whereas with aperture you're essentially controlling the opening of how much light the lens lets into the camera, and with ISO you're controlling how sensitive the actual sensor within the camera reads in the light. And you look at these settings, you're like, okay, this is all good and fine. However, why couldn't you just keep the camera on auto mode and just let it make all the decisions? But then you learn that each of these different variables actually have different effects on the final image, and that there are many other creative decisions made behind the scenes for every single photo. Knowing this does 2 different things. First, it opens up your world of possibilities, but at the same time might cause some doubt, maybe some confusion, and it sometimes opens more questions rather than answers. However, when you go through the weeds, you start to have an understanding of how all of this works. This leads us to another important photographic principle that we haven't covered yet, and this is the idea of composition. And simply, the way you actually frame the image communicates a message. Take example of some of the most classic ones, like the rule of thirds, where you always keep the subject on some third of the frame. Or the idea of leading lines, using geometry and lines to help communicate where the subject is and bring focus to that subject. Or maybe think of even something like the rule of odds, how an odd amount of objects actually helps make a more pleasing composition. What we see are all these choices are something that require intentionality, which takes framing to actually communicate what the subject is. Taking the physics of light and aperture to separate the subject by having a shallow depth of field. Communicating motion either through a fast shutter speed to freeze it or slow shutter speed to convey that motion. Photography ultimately isn't about recording reality as we always see it. Rather, it is taking something that may be mundane, or taking something that's already beautiful and showing and presenting it in the way that we ultimately see it. This lends itself in an aspect of photography that doesn't even involve holding a camera. And this is simply looking at photos, whether it's one that you're taking of your own or someone else's. And let's just take the example of family photos. So why do we even care about these? And I believe the answer is that what these do is they communicate emotion, they communicate a story, they communicate something deeper within them. They're not just photos, rather they are a representation of reality, whether a reality that we experience ourselves or the reality of someone else, what they experienced and what they want to communicate. The thing about photography is that it's an art form that takes reality and hones into an aspect of it to communicate a story. And that's why it's such a powerful thing. I know this is cliche, but you know the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I think this is true. A lot of people think photography is something that we like because of the cool tech, of the expensive thousands of dollars of cameras and lenses. Some people think that we enjoy photography because of learning about the technical details, or even the aspect of creating art and letting out our creativity. Despite all of this, I believe that photography isn't even about taking photos and sharing with others. Yes, that is a great byproduct of it. However, what I argue is that the journey of learning photography does something to you. What it does is it changes and shapes your perception of the world around you, so that through your knowledge, you're able to see the beauty in the mundane, the story through the ordinary, and through that, you gain a new lease on what the world is like, and then you can share it to others. Photography is a medium that communicates a story. It communicates a part of reality that we often miss. It is honing into the details of everyday life and showing how life is a lot more interesting, a lot more colorful, a lot more deep than we often notice. And the reason why we spend so much time in this craft of photography is because what we want to do is to communicate the pieces of reality that we often don't notice, that if we don't click that shutter button would disappear. It's about capturing memories, it's about capturing emotion, it's about capturing the beauty that we see around the world and using that to communicate a message about how the world is so much more vivid, so much more beautiful, so much more interesting than we often notice. And the things that would often disappear if we don't click that